Hello everyone, welcome to week 2. I'm going to use Camtasia again this week because it does really match up with what we need to talk about, and hopefully next week we can do something different. This week I'm just going to do an overview of many of the concepts that are going to hold us together for the rest of this course. Now this is an overview, so I'm just going to be talking briefly about some key concepts, and they're definitely not going to be exhausted through this discussion. They're just going to be touched upon. So please just understand that it's just an introduction, and if you don't understand every single thing about this concept, know that we're going to revisit it as the course goes on. So this week's objectives are as follows. I'd like you to internalize a few concepts related to educational funding in Saskatchewan. Secondly, we're going to cover the 6 principles of funding design. This is one of the objectives out of this course, and you have a rubric related to that. Thirdly, I'm uploading some newspaper articles from 2008-2009 to help you understand some of the issues around educational funding in this province that are still relevant. And lastly, we're going to talk a bit about the benefit-based principle, which covers who should pay for education and why, and that sort of thing. So just to start off, defining educational finance. Lawton says that it's the acquisition, allocation, and management of funds. Actually, when we define educational finance, it has very, very little to do with funding the actual cost of education. And the reason for that is that we don't know how much it costs to actually educate a child. The Saskatchewan curriculum says that one of our goals is to educate a child to their full potential. Well, we don't know what that is. We could make some guesses for the average child, but we don't really know what it costs to educate someone to their full potential. So whenever anybody ever says to me, we're funding the cost of education, that's simply not true, because we don't know what that is. Instead, we're funding an average. We might have an average for special needs students, we might have an average for French students, that kind of thing, and we work with those. So really, it's getting a pot of money from people in the province, either through taxes on property or GST, PST, and then dividing it into smaller, equitable pots, and then managing that pot of money at the school and division level. In Canada, we spend about 20% of all government money on education. This is relatively high. We're actually the highest among the G8 countries, and if you compare some large international countries, say China or Japan, they spend 2 to 4% of all government monies on education. So it's a lot about what we do in the country. We value education highly. Education is divided up in 3 ways, 3 areas of responsibility. We have federal responsibility, provincial, and local. Our federal government takes care of First Nations education, and that's higher ed as well as K-12. All of the money for band schools and First Nations schools comes from the federal government. Now, if a First Nation student is attending a provincial school, that student is funded from the provincial government. But if they attend a First Nations band school, then they're funded by the federal government. The federal government also funds all post-secondary education, largely through transfer payments to the provincial government, and then the provincial government makes some contributions to that if they want to, and then that goes to the universities or community colleges or whatever else. The federal government also takes care of education for inmates and military service, so veteran education is funded by the federal government. The provincial government, our Saskatchewan government, funds K-12 schools. Now that also includes pre-K now in some areas, and they control curriculum, they control provincial legislation like the Education Act, and they control the way that money is collected, who it's collected from, and at what levels. And lastly, the local government. So that would be our school division, our school boards, local organizations, and they control the budgets that they get. They don't set the budgets anymore. They used to set the budgets prior to 2009, but now the levels that they can ask for is set. And they also manage the accounting, local policies, division policies, and those types of things. And so 3 tiers of government that influence education and education funding in our country. Now this is historic. The reason it's this way is because of the BNA Act in 1867. So if you squint your eyes and you take a look at what's on your screen right now, the BNA Act actually dictated or outlined that education would be a provincial responsibility. Also in the BNA Act is religious education, First Nations funding, because of the Indian Act, is still controlled federally. Now, of course, the BNA Act folded into the Constitution, and you see that things are quite similarly listed here. When we look into where money comes from to fund education in the province, and we're going to talk about this in much more detail later on, and don't worry, it's exciting. Funding generally comes from two places. We do have miscellaneous funds, so three, but largely two major sources of funding in the province. The first is provincial grants, and that comes from our General Revenue Fund, which consists of PST money, GST money, production taxes, things like that. And that funds almost 60%, like 58 point something percent of education in the province. Property taxes fund about 40%, 38 to 39% of the costs of education in our province. And property taxes come from residential housing, from businesses, things like that. Every property, actually, unless they're exempt, pays into education funding. And lastly, the third one is the miscellaneous, rentals, fees, things like that. And that's a very small amount. It varies from school division to school division, maybe 2%, maybe 3%. So just to recap this, and we're going to be talking about it a little bit later, is provincially 60% of the funding for education comes from the province, and 40% comes from property tax. Prior to March 18th, I believe, 2009, it was the other way around. Property taxes funded 60% of education, and the General Revenue Fund, or the province, funded 40%. And this was a huge topic. I grew up on a farm, and I remember my dad talking about how much money farmers had to pay for education, regardless of whether or not they had children. And it was just something that didn't sit well with many, many people. So this switch made a change. I don't know that it has alleviated any of the burden of taxation, depending on how people spend, and we'll be talking about that next week when we talk about the principles of taxation, because really education is generally, K-12 education is generally funded publicly. So whether you're paying GST and PST and you're paying for education, or you're paying it through property tax, which everybody pays, even if they're paying rent, a portion of the rent goes to the property tax, they're still funding education. Funding education is a contentious issue. It's a very, very public issue, and one of the reasons for that is that it shows up on your property tax statements every single year. So if you own a house and you get your property tax assessment, you open the letter up and you'll see three things that you're taxed on. One is the taxes for your home, the other one is the taxes for the library, which is usually quite a bit smaller, and the other one is your municipal tax, so the city tax or RM tax or whatever else. And education tax is a large piece of that. And so people really feel like they are spending money on education directly, even though education funding provincially is maybe 14–15%. We'll talk about that a little bit later. People really feel very, very responsible and very that they have a lot of accountability in terms of funding that. So it becomes an issue. And it's in competition with other things. Take a look at this chart. This is what's going on in our province. On this chart, and this is from 2012-2013, General Revenue Funding in Saskatchewan, our province spends almost 42% on health. We know that. We know that the electorate supports a lot of health decisions, and so the government responds accordingly and spends a lot of money on health. Social services, 7.6, agriculture, 3.8, highways, 3.8, debt servicing, 3.6, and other, which has pages in the GRF expense area of the budget. Now on this chart, education is listed as 22.3% of all funding in the province. But take a look at the small writing on the bottom right of this chart. This includes ministries of education and advanced education, employment, and immigration. And so it's a little bit misleading. If you read this report, which I'm sure you're going to run to it right after this, education actually for K-12 is 14.3% of all provincial expenses, and that includes teachers' pension. So when we remove the advanced education, employment, and immigration, which is a complete separate department or branch, we're left with around 14.3%. Yet, people are really tied to how education is funded, likely because it shows up on those tax forms. Now, just for a quick comparison, I went and grabbed the Alberta one, and here it is. Their health is about the same. Education, which excludes the pension plan, is 20.3% on this one. If you really want to take a look at it and you go to this, this document from Alberta, you'll notice that they spend a little bit more. One of the issues in education right now, and we're all feeling it, is local autonomy versus centralized control. Our government is really aggressively moving to centralized control and moving away from local autonomy. They did that in 2009 when they moved from a 60% property tax funding, which is very locally controlled, to 40% property tax. And then, of course, moving from 40% government funding to 60%. And I think we've all lived long enough to know that whoever controls the purse strings or holds the purse string holds the power. And that is what's happening in our province right now. Because the government is funding 60%, like more than 50% of the cost of education, they have a lot of control over what happens in every single school division. Prior to 2009, there were actually some wealthy school boards, and the reason those school boards were wealthy is that they would set a mill rate, which we'll talk about in a few weeks, that would allow them to collect enough money from their electorate that they didn't even have to collect any money from a provincial grant. And you might have heard this term. Those were called zero grant boards. And zero grant boards didn't really have to listen to the government for anything. They could, because they were raising all the money locally from property taxes, they could make whatever decisions they wanted to, and the government couldn't do anything about it. I've even heard some colleagues of mine, some ex-principals, say that they wouldn't even submit documents to the government because the government didn't give them any money, so they wouldn't do the work. And I'm sure this caused a lot of problems, but that's one of the things that would happen. They had a lot of local autonomy. We're not allowed to set mill rates locally anymore. Again, we'll talk about that in a few weeks. We have one provincial mill rate that every single person has to pay in the province. So depending on how much their property is worth, it's multiplied by a mill rate, and that's what they pay in property taxes. Prior to 2009, every single school division could set their own mill rate. So depending on where you lived, and depending on the value of your home, you paid different levels into education funding. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. There are also other sources of funding that are not included in the grant formula, and we'll talk about that in the later weeks of this course. Other sources of funding include school fees, and we'll be talking about how that has become an issue in the courts. Also, alternate sources, for example, school foundations, which are popping up more and more and more. Partnerships that school divisions have, and some of the funds from that just come in through in-kind funding. Cost-saving measures, such as using equipment that takes less power, hoping that you'll save some money and be able to spend it in other places. And there are some other sources of funding as well through donations and things like that. Again, we'll be talking about that later, but I just wanted to bring it up now so that it's on our minds. And now let's go into the principles of funding design. This is, again, one of the objectives of this course, and I actually find it quite fascinating because when I consider these principles of funding design, which seem to be quite universal in many of the textbooks that I've looked at, and then I look at our funding formula, it gives me a place to think about things. Without these, we don't really know what we're looking for in a funding formula. And it's difficult to decide whether one funding formula is better than another one. But these seem to be quite common, quite universal principles of funding design, and there are 6. A funding formula should be efficient, accountable and understandable, autonomous and flexible, predictable and stable, fair and equitable, and neutral. Let's go through each of those. The principle of efficiency means that it doesn't cost a lot to actually collect the money. So if a system works well, it's built into what we're already doing, and we can collect the money without having to do a whole lot of extra work. We try to do that efficiently in our province. I don't know that we are very efficient because developing new funding formulas takes a lot of work, and there is a branch in the government dedicated to just this type of work. But we rationalize that by saying, well, we do need to spend some money on collecting the money to finance education because education is important. So efficiency. Secondly, accountable and understandable. Now, accountable in finance means something very different than accountable in other areas. When we think about accountability, and the most common definition of the term, that means being accountable for the money that we spend, knowing where it goes, being public and transparent about it. But actually, accountability refers to how close or the shortest distance between where the money is collected and where it is spent. So in finance, something is more accountable if the money is collected locally and spent locally. And it's less accountable if it's collected locally and spent elsewhere. And understandable, that means that we know how the formula works. We can follow, we can track, we can see that money collected this way multiplied by this factor and this mill rate. This is exactly what it would look like after it runs through the formula. You can decide whether or not the formula is accountable. We'll be covering it in a few weeks. I believe the funding manual is about ½ inch thick, so you can make your decisions on that. So accountable and understandable. Third principle, autonomous and flexible. Autonomous means people who collect the money get to decide how it is spent, and flexible means there's enough flexibility in it to be able to respond to the needs of the people that you're working with. So if something would happen in an area that all of a sudden we need more money, or we need to make some adjustments, that we can quickly do that. So autonomous and flexible is based on the ideas that the funding is community responsive, it reflects local interests, and it's determined locally. We do know in our province that we no longer determine the mill rates, and we have very, very little to do with setting our budgets. This is all determined now through a formula since March 2009. So again, you can make decisions on whether or not our distribution mechanism in Saskatchewan is autonomous and flexible. Next, predictable and stable. A predictable formula means you kind of know how much money you're going to get from year to year, and stable means it really doesn't change a whole lot and that you can anticipate those changes. Those are quite straightforward. And then the last one is equitable and fair, and I've divided that into a couple of slides because they mean a couple different things. Equitability means that every student in the province, regardless of where they are, should be allowed access to a similar or comparable level of education as any other student in the province. And we already know that this is difficult to do. I mean, you go to a small town where there are 4 teachers and a student wants to take biology 30. It's likely going to be a different biology 30, and I'm not cutting down small towns, don't get me wrong, but it's likely going to be a different biology 30 than, say, a great big city where there are many biology 30 expert teachers. In that small town, maybe the biology 30 teacher is also the chemistry 20 teacher, and maybe they teach phys ed grade 6, and maybe they teach art grade 4. Who knows? I don't think I'm coming up with a really, really wacky example there. And so equitability is difficult to attain. Equitability also sometimes goes against some of the other principles of funding. For example, equitability versus autonomy or flexibility. Autonomy and flexibility, you kind of want the funding to match what the area needs. But if we're supposed to be equitable, well, which one kind of comes first? And so that's what we look for. Now, in our province, we often look at equitability in terms of inputs because it's really, really difficult to measure it in terms of outputs. Outputs would presume that every single child that graduates from grade 12 has an equal chance of doing whatever it is that they want to do as compared to every other child. And this is impossible to figure out because of the uniqueness among individuals. So we determine it by inputs, making sure that every area gets about the same amount of money, and then what they choose to do with that money is up to them. And lastly, fairness. And fairness has to do with distribution of money, but also collection of money. So it's going to come up again when we talk about principles of taxation. Fairness means, in finance, that those who have more pay more, and those who have less pay less. It also refers to vertical equity, which means, well, actually horizontal equity, which means everybody pays to their level, but vertical equity means those who have more pay more and those who have less pay less, like I just said. We try to do that through property taxes by saying that people with more expensive houses ought to contribute more to education, but then the outputs of that are there's still equity in that their child is still going to get a comparable education to any other student in the province. And in Saskatchewan, this is relatively true because we don't have private schools where people have the opportunity of paying tuition and getting a different level of education than others. So those are the 6 principles of funding. I do hope that they're relatively clear. We will be talking about them again, but you'll notice that you can do a whole lot with some of those ideas when you start to break down the funding formula. And you'll also notice that when you read the newspaper articles from 2008-2009 that I'm including in this week's readings, that it's easy to pick at them with any of these principles. I do hope that it makes you feel very, very competent as well, that you're already learning some things in Ed Finance. So just to sum up, educational funding is really perceptual. It really, really is. It's not a mathematically precise thing. There's relative perceptions of goodness and badness in it. We apply those 6 principles based on what we perceive to be more important or less important. And on this slide, I talk about whether or not we even believe that that we ought to spend more on education or less on education, and that's perceptual as well. One of my best friends is a farmer, and he believes that we overinvest in education in the province. And of course, well, look at my job. I believe that we underinvest in education in our province. And so I've included that little tidbit about GDP per capita. A 1% increase in a country's literacy score increases labor productivity by 2.5, and 1.5 increase in GDP per capita. That's huge in my mind. But again, that's perceptual. I value education, and so I would fight that we always contribute more. And the last concept that I want to talk about is the benefit-based principle. And again, this is something that you may want to talk about again. It'll come up again. If it makes sense to you, use it in your work. If it doesn't, leave it. But the benefit-based principle really has to do with who should be paying for education and at what point. And the argument inherent in the benefit-based principle is whether or not education is a private good versus a public good. A private good is the person who is receiving the benefit should pay for the benefit, and a public good is that the beneficiaries are larger, more community-based, therefore the community should pay. And when we look at education funding in Saskatchewan, the way that it's divided out, we, and I do a royal we with quotation marks, you can't see that right now, we consider pre-K to 12 education as a public good. Generally, it's paid for using public monies. Now, I know that it's collected through property taxes, but that money becomes public money. And so we consider pre-K to 12 public. And then at some point when students start going to university or to community colleges, there starts to be a private good piece in there. It's not 100% because university tuition only covers about 16% of the cost of university education, but there's an implication in that all of a sudden a university education becomes a private good. Sometimes I've listened to discussions where some believe that after 16, there's a benefit-based principle that should come into play where students should be responsible to pay for their education past this age, and maybe that would get those students to be more invested in their education or things like that. Now we haven't really toyed a lot with that in Saskatchewan, but this principle, this conversation is out there, and we call it the benefit-based principle. And again, another way of looking at it is the public good versus private good. Private goods should be paid for by the user, public, tax-based by the community. And oftentimes funding mechanisms consider both. Your discussion posts for this week are the following. I'd like you to comment on the 6 principles of funding design and think about how we're doing as a province. Secondly, what are your thoughts on the issues from the newspaper articles? And you can comment on those. And thirdly, is education a public good or a private good? Or a portion of each? And how much? And why? Now, many people are going to ask me, how many times should we post? What should we be doing in the discussion posts? And I don't really have rules for that. I can, at the end of the course or at the end of the week or at the end of a month, I can take a look at how many posts you've done, how much time you're spending in the course, and things like that. And I do that, but that does presume that I understand completely how it is that you learn, and I'm not going to go ahead and presuppose that. But I will say there is a rubric in your syllabus that should guide you to how many posts that you should be making and to what extent. I would be looking for a variety of posts, sometimes posts that you're just affirming someone else's work, other times posts that show that you've developed some solid insights and contributions to the class. On average, students post 3, maybe 4 times per week. I wouldn't be expecting a whole lot more than that. I think it's quite time consuming to come up with a meaningful post. And I also would suggest that you would make a post that would be about the same length as a classroom conversation. So sometimes a post might be 2 sentences, other times it might be 8 sentences. A post is often not half a page. Please consider the audience that you're speaking to. You don't want to be bombarding them with a whole lot of information, but maybe once or twice it will get close to half a page, depending on what it is that you're saying. If you are posting something that's half a page and you're engaging in a back and forth conversation on one particular week and you made 6, 8 meaningful posts, I would suggest that you submit that for credit on one of the learning outcomes or objectives for the course. So I hope that was helpful. I'm going to stop talking now because I am concerned about talking too long, and I encourage you to read the newspaper articles and respond to these posts online.